What would you do if the ghosts of your past came knocking at your door, not as memories, but as a living, breathing reminder of everything you've lost? What if the one thing that could save you was the very thing you thought you'd left behind on the battlefield? And what if that thing wasn't even human? In the heart of rural Montana, under a sky so wide it feels like it could swallow you whole, a man sits alone in a world that no longer fits him. His name is Jack Monroe, a former Marine, a veteran of wars fought in far-off deserts where the sun burned hotter than the devil's own furnace. Now, he's just a shadow of who he used to be, living in a creaky old trailer on the outskirts of a nowhere town, surrounded by nothing but the endless stretch of pine forests and the distant howl of the wind through the Bitterroot Mountains. The air here smells of damp earth and regret, and every creak of the trailer's rusted frame seems to echo the fractures in Jack's soul. His hands, once steady enough to hold a rifle under enemy fire, now tremble as he pours cheap whiskey into a chipped glass, the amber liquid glinting like the memories he can't escape. On his wrist, a faded tattoo of a Marine Corps emblem peeks out from under a flannel sleeve, a permanent mark of a life he can't reclaim. Outside, the American flag hangs limp on a makeshift pole, tattered at the edges, much like the man who raised it there every morning out of habit, not pride. Jack's days are a quiet kind of hell, a grinding routine of survival in a land that feels as unforgiving as the wars he fought. He wakes before dawn, not because he wants to, but because sleep is a luxury his mind won't allow. The nightmares come like clockwork, flashes of sand and smoke, the roar of explosions, the screams of men whose faces he can still name. He shuffles out to the porch with a mug of black coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, and stares out at the misty mountains as if they might hold the answers he's been searching for. The small town of Darby ain't much, just a handful of diners and gas stations along Highway 93, where folks tip their cowboy hats and say "mornin'" like they mean it. But Jack keeps to himself. He's not one for small talk or the 4th of July barbecues down at the community center where the stars and stripes wave proudly and veterans are slapped on the back like heroes. He knows they mean well, but their gratitude feels like a weight he can't carry. At the local VA clinic, he picks up his meds, pills that are supposed to dull the edges of his PTSD, but only make him feel like a stranger in his own skin. He's got a job hauling lumber for a local mill, back-breaking work that keeps his body busy but does nothing for the storm raging in his head. His co-workers, good old boys with names like Travis and Hank, crack jokes about fishing trips and rodeos, but Jack just nods, forcing a half-smile that never reaches his pale blue eyes. They don't see the way his jaw clenches when a truck backfires on the yard, sounding too much like a mortar round. They don't know that every night, when he sits alone in that trailer with nothing but the hum of an old radio for company, he stares at a locked box under his bed, a box he hasn't opened in years but can't bring himself to throw out. It's a box that holds more than just mementos. It holds the weight of a promise he broke, a bond he severed when he came back stateside, shattered in ways no Purple Heart could honor. Sometimes, late at night when the whiskey's gone and the silence presses in like a vice, Jack swears he can hear it. A low, familiar whine, a sound that cuts through the fog of memory like a blade. But it can't be real. It's just his mind playing tricks, dragging up ghosts from a life he buried in the sands of Afghanistan. He tells himself to shake it off, to cowboy up like his daddy used to say, but there's a crack in his armor, a fissure that's been widening for years. It's in the way he avoids mirrors, not wanting to see the hollow man staring back. It's in the way he flinches at the sound of fireworks on Independence Day, ducking behind his trailer like he's still in a firefight. And it's in the way he keeps a worn-out photo tucked into his wallet, not of a sweetheart or a family, but of something else, something that meant more to him than any human ever could. He hasn't looked at that photo in months, but its presence burns a hole in his pocket, a silent reminder of the one thing he failed to protect, when it mattered most. Today started like any other, with the grey Montana dawn creeping over the horizon, painting the pines in shades of silver and shadow. Jack hauled himself out of bed, his body aching from yesterday's shift at the mill, and brewed his coffee with the same mechanical precision he once used to clean his M16. He stepped outside, letting the cold air bite at his skin, grounding him for just a moment before the memories could creep in. He had a long day ahead, another 12 hours of stacking timber, ignoring the sideways glances from the younger guys who don't get why he's always so damn quiet. He was halfway through his second cup of joe, watching a pair of bald eagles circle high above, when something broke the stillness. It wasn't the usual sound of a logging truck rumbling down the dirt road, or the chatter of magpies in the trees. It was something softer, something that didn't belong, a low, persistent scratch at the base of his trailer door, like nails against wood, accompanied by a faint, almost mournful whine. Jack froze, the mug halfway to his lips, his heart slamming against his ribcage. It couldn't be, not after all this time. He told himself it was just a stray, some mutt looking for scraps, but his gut knew better. That sound, it was etched into his bones, a call he answered 1,000 times, in a place where death was always just one step behind. He set the mug down with a clatter, his breath coming in shallow bursts, and moved toward the door with a caution he hadn't felt since his last patrol. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and that whine, it wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a plea, a memory made real. Jack's hand hovered over the rusted knob, his mind screaming at him to turn away, to lock the door and drown the noise in another shot of bourbon. But something deeper, something he thought he'd buried under layers of pain and guilt, wouldn't let him. He twisted the knob, the door creaking open with a groan, and there, standing in the pale morning light, was a sight that ripped the ground out from under him. A dog, lean, scarred, with a coat of mottled brown and black, one ear torn at the tip, stared up at him with eyes that hadn't changed in all the years since they'd last locked gazes. Those eyes, amber and unyielding, held 1,000 unspoken stories of bomb-sniffing missions, of nights spent curled together under a starry desert sky for warmth, of a bond forged in the crucible of war. It was Ghost, his old K9 partner, the military working dog who'd saved his life more times than he could count, the one he'd been forced to leave behind when his tour ended, and his mind started to unravel. Ghost, who shouldn't be here, who couldn't be here, not after everything. But there he was, trembling on Jack's doorstep, a living ghost from a past he thought he'd outrun. And in that moment, Jack felt something break open inside him. A wound he'd stitched shut long ago, now raw and bleeding all over again. How had Ghost found him? And why, after all these years, had he come back to a man who'd failed him in the worst way? Jack stood frozen in the doorway, the cold Montana morning biting at his skin as his eyes locked with Ghost's amber gaze. His breath caught in his throat, ragged and shallow, as if the air itself had turned to glass, sharp and unforgiving. His hands, those same hands that had once guided Ghost through minefields with unshakable trust, now clenched into fists at his sides, trembling not from the chill, but from a storm inside him he couldn't name. It was impossible. Ghost couldn't be here. Not after all these years, not after the papers Jack had signed, the goodbyes he hadn't even been allowed to say. He'd left Ghost behind in Afghanistan, handed over to another handler, a decision that had carved a hollow place in his chest he'd spent years trying to ignore. And yet, here he was, a scarred, weary echo of the dog who'd once been his shadow, his shield, his only tether to sanity in a world of chaos. Jack's mind reeled, torn between disbelief and a raw, aching recognition. Those eyes, God, those eyes, were a mirror to every loss, every failure, every night he'd spent drowning in whiskey to forget. Guilt slammed into him like a freight train, heavy and relentless, dragging up the memory of that last day. the sound of Ghost's confused whine as Jack walked away, the weight of knowing he'd broken a bond stronger than blood. He didn't deserve this reunion. He didn't deserve Ghost's loyalty, not after abandoning him. But as the dog took a hesitant step forward, his torn ear twitching, Jack felt something crack open inside, a wound he'd cauterized with time, now bleeding fresh and fierce. He staggered back a step, the creak of the trailer floor under his boots grounding him for just a moment before the panic clawed its way up his spine. "No, no, you can't be here," he muttered, his voice rough, barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder would shatter the illusion. But Ghost didn't vanish. He tilted his head, letting out a low, keening whine that cut straight to Jack's core, a sound so familiar it was like hearing his own heartbeat. Jack's knees felt weak, his chest tight with a mix of fear and shame. What if this wasn't real? What if his mind, already fractured by years of PTSD, had finally snapped, conjuring up the one thing he'd lost that hurt the most? He pressed a hand to his forehead, squeezing his eyes shut, willing the vision to disappear. But when he opened them, Ghost was still there, closer now, his paws leaving faint prints in the frost-dusted dirt. The dog's fur was matted in places, his frame thinner than Jack remembered, and a fresh wave of guilt washed over him. How long had Ghost been out there, alone, searching for him? How many miles had those paws traveled just to find a man who didn't deserve to be found? Jack's throat burned as he crouched down, not daring to touch. Not yet, but unable to look away. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words tasting like ash. "I'm so damn sorry, boy. I never should have left you." Ghost's ears perked at the sound of his voice, and for a moment Jack swore he saw understanding in those eyes, a forgiveness he couldn't accept. The moment hung heavy between them, fragile as a spiderweb, until the distant rumble of a logging truck down the dirt road snapped Jack back to the present. He couldn't stay here, exposed on his porch, where anyone could see this impossible reunion and ask questions he didn't have answers for. He straightened up, his body moving on autopilot, and gestured toward the trailer door with a shaky hand. "Come on, inside, quick!" Ghost obeyed instantly, just like he used to, padding past Jack with a limp that hadn't been there before, each step a silent accusation. Jack shut the door behind them, the click of the latch sounding louder than it should, sealing them in with a tension that pressed against the walls of the small, dim space. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and old regrets, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just let a ghost cross the threshold, not just of his home, but of his soul. He watched as Ghost sniffed at the corners of the trailer, his movement slow but deliberate, as if reclaiming a space he'd never been in, but somehow knew. Jack's heart thudded painfully as he noticed the scars on Ghost's flank, jagged lines that spoke of battles fought without him. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, more to himself than to the dog, his voice thick with a rage he hadn't felt in years. But underneath the anger was something deeper, something colder, fear. Fear of what Ghost's presence meant, of the memories it dragged to the surface, of the man he'd have to become to face them. The day passed in a haze, every tick of the clock on the wall a reminder of how unprepared Jack was for this. He skipped his shift at the mill, letting the phone ring unanswered when Travis called to check on him, his usual gruff, "Where the hell are you, Monroe?" echoing through the voicemail. Jack couldn't face the outside world, not with Ghost here, a living contradiction to the life he'd built on denial. Instead, he sat on the sagging couch, a bottle of whiskey untouched on the coffee table, watching as Ghost curled up at his feet like no time had passed at all. But time had passed, hadn't it? Years of silence, of pain, of nights spent replaying that final goodbye in his head until it was a loop he couldn't escape. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands, the weight of Ghost's steady breathing, a tether he both needed and dreaded. Memories crept in unbidden, flashes of desert patrols under a merciless sun, Ghost's nose to the ground, sniffing out danger while Jack covered his six. The night an IED went off too close, the blast throwing them both to the sand, Ghost's bark cutting through the ringing in Jack's ears as he dragged him to safety. The quiet moments between missions when Jack would scratch behind Ghost's ears and murmur promises he couldn't keep. "I'll get us out of this, boy. I swear." But he hadn't. He'd come home alone, broken in ways no one could see, while Ghost stayed behind, a soldier without a choice. The shame of that betrayal gnawed at him now, sharper than ever, as he sat in the suffocating stillness of his trailer. Hours turned into dusk, the light outside fading to a bruised purple when Jack finally forced himself to move. He couldn't just sit here, paralyzed by the past. Ghost needed food, water, care, things Jack wasn't sure he could give, not with his own life barely holding together. But as he rummaged through the sparse cabinets for something edible, his hand brushed against a small, dented tin box tucked behind a bag of stale crackers. He froze, knowing exactly what it was without looking. It was the same box he kept under his bed, the one he hadn't opened in years, now somehow misplaced in his half-hearted attempts to organize his mess of a life. His fingers hovered over the lid, the cold metal a silent challenge. Inside were relics of a time he'd tried to bury, dog tags, not his own, but Ghost's, etched with a serial number and the words, "Military Working Dog." A crumpled letter from a buddy in his unit, dated months after Jack had been shipped stateside, detailing how Ghost had been reassigned, and a small, worn-out collar, the leather still holding the faint scent of sand and sweat. Jack's chest tightened as he lifted the lid, the contents spilling out like a confession he wasn't ready to make. Ghost, sensing the shift, padded over and nudged Jack's hand with his muzzle, his warmth a stark contrast to the cold ache inside. "You remember this, don't you?" Jack rasped, holding up the collar, his voice breaking on the words. Ghost let out a soft huff, almost an answer, and Jack felt the dam inside him crack further, tears he hadn't shed in years burning at the edges of his vision. That night, unable to sleep, Jack took Ghost outside, the two of them standing under the vast Montana sky, the stars sharp and unyielding above the Bitterroot Mountains. It was a landscape that felt like it belonged to another world, a place of raw, untamed beauty that mirrored the chaos in Jack's soul. He'd come to this nowhere town to disappear, to escape the ghosts of war, but now one stood beside him, real as the ground under his boots. "How'd you find me, boy?" he asked, his voice low, carried away by the wind. Ghost didn't answer, of course, but he pressed closer, his scarred flank against Jack's leg, a silent promise that he wasn't going anywhere. Jack's mind churned with questions. How Ghost had escaped or been released, who had let him go, why he'd traveled God knows how far to end up on this doorstep. But those questions led to others, darker ones. Was someone looking for Ghost? Was there a past tied to those new scars that Jack couldn't protect him from? The thought sent a chill down his spine, colder than the night air, and he knew he couldn't keep ignoring the truth. Ghost's return wasn't just a miracle. It was a reckoning. The next morning, Jack drove into Derby, Ghost riding shotgun in his beat-up Ford pickup, the dog's head resting on the cracked leather seat like he'd never left. The town was waking up, folks shuffling into the diner for coffee and gossip, the American flag flapping lazily outside the post office. Jack parked near the VA clinic, his usual stop for meds, but today felt different, heavier. He needed answers, or at least a starting point, and the only person he could think to ask was Doc Hargrove, the grizzled old psychiatrist who'd been trying to piece Jack's mind back together for years. Inside the clinic, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee, and Jack kept Ghost close, ignoring the curious glances from the receptionist. When Doc Hargrove called him in, the older man's bushy eyebrows shot up at the sight of the dog. "Didn't know you got yourself a companion, Monroe." Doc said, his tone cautious, pen poised over a notepad. Jack shifted in the stiff chair, his hands clasped tight to keep them from shaking. He's not just a dog. He was mine. From over there. Showed up yesterday, out of nowhere. I don't know how or why, but he's here. The words tumbled out, rough and uneven, and Doc's expression softened, though his eyes held a flicker of concern. "That's one hell of a story, Jack," Doc said, leaning back in his chair, his voice steady but laced with something unspoken. "Military dogs, they don't just wander off. There's paperwork, protocols. If he's really yours, someone's going to want answers. You ready for that?" Jack's jaw clenched, the implication hanging heavy between them. He wasn't ready. Not for questions, not for the possibility of losing Ghost again. But before he could respond, Doc reached into a drawer and pulled out a faded business card, sliding it across the desk. "Friend of mine, retired handler, works with a vet rescue group out of Missoula. Might know something about lost K9s. Give him a call. But Jack," Doc paused, his gaze piercing, "you gotta ask yourself if you're strong enough to dig into this, 'cause whatever brought that dog back to you, it ain't gonna be easy to face." Jack took the card, the edges worn, and nodded curtly, though inside doubt gnawed at him. Strong enough? He hadn't been strong enough for anything in years, not for himself, not for Ghost, not for the life he'd left in pieces. Back in the truck, Jack sat with the engine idling, the card burning a hole in his pocket. Ghost nudged his arm, a quiet insistence, and Jack let out a shaky laugh that sounded more like a sob. "You ain't giving me a choice, are you?" he muttered, scratching behind Ghost's torn ear, the gesture so familiar it hurt. But Doc's words echoed in his head, a warning he couldn't ignore. Digging into Ghost's return meant facing parts of his past he'd buried deep, parts that might shatter what little stability he'd scraped together. He thought of the locked box under his bed, the one he'd moved back there after last night, its contents a map of everything he'd lost. Maybe it was time to open it for good, to read that letter again, to remember, or maybe it was time to run, to take Ghost and disappear deeper into the wilderness where no one could find them. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, even through the truck's tinted windows, and for a fleeting moment he wondered if any of his subscribers, you folks who've stuck with these stories of broken men and second chances, would understand what he was about to do. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more to unpack, and I promise you don't want to miss what's coming. Jack's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the Bitterroot Mountains loomed like sentinels, ancient and unyielding, a stark reminder of how small he was in the grand scheme of things. This was America at its rawest, a land of wide-open spaces and hidden scars, much like the ones he carried. He could drive north, past Glacier National Park, lose himself in the vastness of it all, Ghost by his side. Or he could stay, call the number on that card, and face whatever truth waited on the other end of the line. His heart pounded as he looked at Ghost, whose steady, unblinking stare seemed to say, "I'm here now. What are you going to do about it?" The dog's loyalty was a blade, cutting through the fog of Jack's indecision, forcing him to confront a question he'd avoided for too long. Was he still the man Ghost believed in, the one who'd promised to protect him no matter what? Or had that man died in the desert, buried under the weight of war and regret? "I ain't got the answers, boy," Jack whispered, his voice trembling with a vulnerability he hadn't allowed in years. "But I owe you. More than I can ever repay. So if this is gonna hurt, if this is gonna drag us both through hell, I'm in. I ain't leaving you again." Ghost let out a low, approving huff, resting his head on Jack's thigh, and in that moment, Jack made his choice. He pulled the business card from his pocket, stared at the unfamiliar name scrawled across it, and grabbed his phone with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. As he dialed the number, each ring felt like a step toward a cliff's edge, the unknown yawning wide beneath him. Whatever came next, Whether it was answers or more pain, he'd face it with Ghost at his side, because this time he wouldn't break that promise. This time he'd fight. For both of them. Jack's thumb hovered over the phone screen for a moment after the call connected, his breath shallow, the weight of each ring echoing in the tight cab of his pickup like a heartbeat he couldn't control. Ghost sat beside him, steady as ever, his amber eyes locked on Jack's face with a quiet intensity that felt like judgment or maybe just faith. The line clicked, and a gruff voice answered on the other end. A man named Carl, the contact from the vet rescue group in Missoula. Jack's voice cracked as he stumbled through an explanation, the words raw and jagged, spilling out like gravel from a wound. He told Carl about Ghost, about the dog showing up out of nowhere, about the years of separation and the guilt that clung to him like damp earth. Carl listened in silence for a long while, only grunting occasionally to show he was still there, until Jack finally ran out of steam, his chest heaving as he gripped the steering wheel with his free hand to keep from shaking apart. Finally, Carl spoke, his tone careful but heavy with implication. "Monroe, I'm going to be straight with you. Military dogs don't just show up. If this is really your K9, someone messed up big time, or someone let him go on purpose. I've seen cases like this before, handlers retiring, units disbanding, dogs slipping through the cracks, but there's always paperwork, always a trail. I can dig into it, pull some strings with old contacts. But you gotta know, if there's a record, if someone's still got claim on him, you might not get to keep him. Are you prepared for that?" Jack's stomach dropped, a cold sweat prickling at the back of his neck. He glanced at Ghost, whose scarred muzzle rested on the seat, and felt a surge of something primal, protective, that he hadn't known was still in him. "I ain't losing him again," he said, quieter than he meant to, but with a steel that surprised even himself. Carl sighed on the other end, a sound like wind through dead trees. "All right then, send me everything you got. Serial numbers, dates, unit info. I'll get back to you in a day or two. But Jack, if there's heat on this dog, if someone comes looking, you're going to have to decide how far you're willing to go to fight for him. And I don't just mean in a courtroom." The call ended with a sharp click, leaving Jack staring at the phone, the silence in the truck thicker than the Montana fog rolling in over the mountains. He didn't drive home right away. He couldn't. His mind was a storm of what-ifs, each one darker than the last. What if Carl found out Ghost had been stolen or discharged under shady terms? What if some brass in a Pentagon office still had a file on him, ready to yank him back into service or worse, put him down as a liability? Jack's hands trembled as he imagined someone showing up at his trailer, clipboard in hand, to take Ghost away again. The thought was a knife to the gut, sharper than any memory of war, because this time he knew he wouldn't survive the loss. He looked over at Ghost, who hadn't moved, who seemed to sense the weight of the moment with that uncanny intuition only a dog who'd seen hell could have. "I ain't letting 'em take you," Jack whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "I don't care what I gotta do. I failed you once, never again." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him, a voice in the back of his mind reminding him how broken he was, how little fight he had left after years of just surviving. The tension coiled tighter in his chest, a spring wound to the breaking point, as he started the engine and pointed the truck back toward the trailer, the road ahead blurring with more than just the coming dusk. The next 2 days were a purgatory of waiting, each hour stretching into an eternity. Jack barely slept, his nights spent on the sagging couch with Ghost curled at his feet, the dog steady breathing the only thing keeping him from spiraling. He didn't go to the mill, didn't answer Travis's calls, didn't even step outside except to let Ghost stretch his legs in the frosted yard. Every creak of the trailer, every distant bark of a neighbor's dog, sent his heart racing, expecting a knock at the door, expecting the worst. He kept the dented tin box out on the coffee table now, no longer hidden, its contents spread across the scarred wood, like a map of his guilt, Ghost's old tags, the crumpled letter, the frayed collar. He read the letter again and again, the faded ink a reminder of how his buddy had written about Ghost's new handler, how the dog had seemed off without Jack, how he'd stopped eating for days after the reassignment. Each word was a punch, a fresh layer of shame, but Jack didn't look away. He couldn't, not anymore. And when he wasn't torturing himself with the past, he was watching Ghost, memorizing every scar, every twitch of that torn ear, as if he could store up enough of him to last through whatever was coming. The tension built like a storm on the horizon, dark and inevitable, until Jack felt like he was holding his breath, waiting for the sky to crack open. It was late on the second day, the sun dipping below the bitterroots in a blaze of blood-red light, when Carl called back. Jack's hand shook as he answered, his pulse a drum in his ears. Carl's voice was gruffer this time, edged with something that sounded like pity. "I got news, Monroe, and it ain't all good. Ghost was officially retired last year. Medical discharge due to injuries sustained on duty. They shipped him stateside, meant to place him with a foster through a program out of Virginia. But the paperwork's a mess. Looks like the foster fell through and he ended up in a shelter. Someone sprung him, don't know who, don't know how. No tags, no microchip scans reported nothing. Officially, he's off the grid. But here's the kicker. There's a note in his file, a flagged request from some desk jockey saying he's a potential asset for retraining if his condition improves. That means if they find him, they could pull him back. And Jack, there's chatter. Someone's been asking around about a dog matching his description, last seen headed west. I don't know how much time you got, but it ain't a lot. Jack felt the ground tilt beneath him, his grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles whitened. They ain't taken him, he growled, the words more a vow than a threat. Carl sighed again, softer this time. I hear you, man. I've been there, but you gotta play this smart, lay low, and if push comes to shove, you gotta decide what you're willing to risk. I'll keep my ear to the ground, but that's all I can do for now. Good luck, Marine. The line went dead, and Jack sat there, the phone slipping from his hand, the weight of Carl's words pressing down like a physical force. He turned to Ghost, who was watching him from the floor, those amber eyes cutting through the haze of fear and fury. And in that moment, something snapped into focus for Jack, a clarity he hadn't felt since the desert, since the days when every decision was life or death. He couldn't run, not this time. He couldn't bury his head in the sand and hope the world passed him by. Ghost had come back to him, against all odds, through God knows what kind of pain and hardship, and Jack owed him more than a life of hiding. He owed him a fight. Kneeling down, he pressed his forehead against Ghost's, his hands cupping the dog's scarred face, the warmth of his fur grounding him in a way nothing else could. I left you once, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears, a confession and a promise rolled into one. I walked away when you needed me most, and I've hated myself every day since. But I'm here now, and I ain't letting anyone tear us apart again. You hear me, boy? We're in this together, no matter what. Ghost let out a low, almost human whine, nudging Jack's face with his muzzle. And for the first time in years, Jack felt the sting of tears break free, hot and unrelenting, falling into Ghost's fur as he held on like a drowning man to a lifeline. It was a moment of absolution, not from Ghost, but from himself, a recognition that he couldn't change the past, but he could damn well fight for the future. The weight of his guilt didn't vanish, but it shifted, becoming something he could carry, something he could use. In the days that followed, Jack changed. It wasn't a Hollywood transformation, no sudden montage of a man reborn, but a slow, gritty shift, the kind that comes from putting one foot in front of the other when every step hurts. He started by cleaning out the trailer, not just sweeping away the dust and empty bottles, but facing the relics of his pain head-on. He took the locked box under his bed, the one he'd avoided for so long, and moved it to a shelf, no longer a secret to be buried, but a reminder to be honored. He read the letter one last time, not as a punishment, but as a record of what he'd lost and what he'd fight to keep. And in a quiet, deliberate act of sacrifice, he took his old Marine Corps tattoo, the faded emblem on his wrist, and scheduled a session at a parlor in Derby to have it reworked. Not covered up, but layered with a small outline of a dog's paw beside it, Ghost's presence etched into his skin as permanently as the memories. It hurt, the needle biting deeper than he expected, but it was a pain he welcomed, a renunciation of the man who'd run from his past, a commitment to the man he needed to be now. He didn't drink as much either, not because he'd sworn off whiskey entirely, but because he found himself wanting to be clear-headed, present for Ghost. He took the dog on long walks through the pine forests, not hiding from the world, but reclaiming it, one muddy trail at a time. And when folks in town started asking questions about the scarred mutt by his side, he didn't flinch or turn away. He told them the truth, or as much of it as he could bear, just enough to let them know Ghost wasn't just a dog, but a piece of his soul he'd thought he'd lost forever. He also prepared. Carl's warning never left him, the specter of chatter and flagged files, a constant shadow over their fragile peace. Jack reached out to a few old buddies from his unit, men who understood the unspoken code of loyalty, men who'd seen the bond between a handler and his canine and would move mountains to protect it. They didn't ask for details, just promised to keep their ears open to let him know if anyone came sniffing around Montana. He set up a contingency too, a duffel bag packed with essentials, a map marked with remote cabins deeper in the Bitterroots. A last resort if push came to shove and they had to disappear. But he didn't dwell on escape as much as he used to. Instead, he focused on the present, on the small victories, teaching Ghost old commands to see if he still remembered, watching the dog's tail wag for the first time in days when Jack tossed a stick across the yard, sitting together on the porch as the stars burned overhead, the silence between them no longer heavy but healing. For the first time in years, Jack felt a flicker of purpose, not just surviving but living, for Ghost, for the bond they'd rebuilt, for the chance to right a wrong he'd carried too long. As winter crept closer, the air turning sharp with the promise of snow, Jack found himself drawn to the edge of his property one evening, where the tattered American flag still hung on its makeshift pole. He stood there with Ghost at his side, the wind tugging at the frayed edges of the fabric, a symbol of a country he'd fought for, a life he'd nearly lost, and a duty he'd never fully escaped. In his hand, he held Ghost's old collar, the leather worn thin from years of war and waiting. He'd thought about burying it, leaving it behind like so much of his pain. But that felt wrong, like denying a piece of their story. Instead, he tied it to the base of the flagpole, looping it tight with hands that no longer shook as much as they used to. It wasn't a grand gesture, not something anyone else would notice, but to Jack, it was everything, a marker of survival, of reunion, of a promise kept against all odds. Ghost pressed against his leg, a warm, solid weight, and Jack let his hand rest on the dog's head, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing under his palm. The mountains loomed in the distance, eternal and unmoved, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season, and Jack let himself believe, just for a moment, that they could weather whatever storm came next. Time, he realized, wasn't just a thief. It was also a builder, piecing together what war had torn apart, one quiet day at a time. And in that vast, unspoken space between the past and the future, there was room for healing, not just for him, but for all the broken things seeking a way back to whole. If this story of second chances, of scars that bind instead of break, has stirred something in you, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what it meant to you. Drop a simple, "I believe in redemption," if Jack and Ghost's fight hit home. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to come back from the edge. And if you're new here, consider hitting that subscribe button. There are more stories like this waiting, tales of grit and grace that might just speak to your soul.